Clean this up, man. My shoes cost more than your monthly rent. The tone was filled with arrogance as District Manager Derek Williams kicked over the yellow mop bucket. Dirty water splashed onto Kesha Washington's navy blue uniform, soaking his worn sneakers. He pulled out his iPhone, smirking at the Instagram Live audience. Watch this janitor learn some respect. But as Kesha silently reached for a tissue, his dark eyes betrayed nothing. Because what Derek didn't know was that the shiny black bag next to his cart held the power to end his career before the day was done. The sound of water splashing across polished marble was sharp enough to turn heads. Golden rays from a morning sun filtered through the towering windows of the 58th floor of Hamilton Global, reflecting off chrome desks and glass walls. It was a place where fortunes were made and destroyed with the swipe of a pen, where appearances mattered more than truth. And on that morning, in the heart of New York City, a single act would set off a chain of events that no one in the building could have predicted. Leonard Carter stood frozen, the mop handle still in his grip, watching a wave of dirty water creep toward his shoes. The cold wetness seeped into the hem of his uniform trousers. Across from him, Regional Manager Derek Williams lowered his polished brown leather shoe into the puddle and kicked the yellow mop bucket over completely. A slow, deliberate move. Not the act of a man trying to avoid a mess, but one looking to create one. My shoes cost more than your monthly paycheck. Derek sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. The words weren't just meant to humiliate. They were meant to wound. And the smirk curling on his lips told everyone he was enjoying it. He pulled out his iPhone, holding like a weapon. Watch this guy learn some respect. He announced, his voice rising just enough to draw the attention of passing employees. The red recording light blinked. Instagram Live. Within seconds, the viewer count ticked upward. Dozens of strangers, now witnesses to Leonard's public shaming. Leonard didn't react. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, didn't fire back. Instead, he reached for a roll of paper towels from his cart. The fluorescent lights glinted off a sleek black briefcase tucked beside his supplies, its gold embossed initials, LC, catching the eye for a brief second before disappearing into the shadow of the cart's frame. The floor buzzed with activity as employees in crisp suits and silk blouses moved between glass offices, carefully averting their gaze from the scene. Everyone knew Derek's reputation. The man wielded power like a blade, cutting down anyone who questioned him, and no one wanted to be next. The comments on Derek's live stream rolled in fast. Fire him already. Teach him who's boss. This is what happens when companies hire anyone off the street. Derek read them with relish, letting the validation fuel his performance. Leonard stayed silent, kneeling to soak up the water. He had done this exact movement countless times over his short tenure at Hamilton Global. But this morning was different. Something in his eyes, still calm, still dark, but with an undercurrent of steel, hinted that this would not end the way Derek expected. Rodriguez. Derek barked into his phone, calling the head of maintenance. Your cleaning guy here is incompetent. I want him out today. Insubordinate, careless. He's damaged company property. The black briefcase remained where it was untouched. Inside, it tucked between documents and a high-polished laptop, lay the kind of truth that could dismantle a man's career in minutes. A truth no one here suspected. Leonard's phone buzzed in his pocket. A simple text from Chairman R. See you at 10 a.m. He glanced at the clock. 93. 47 minutes until the board meeting. 47 minutes until the pieces of a 3W WCAG plan would fall perfectly into place. Luis Rodriguez, the maintenance director, stepped off the elevator. He'd been with the company 15 years long, enough to smell trouble before it landed on his doorstep. What's the problem here? He asked, his gaze shifting between Derek's smirking face and Leonard's steady one. This guy is disrespectful, Derek said smoothly, raising his phone higher so the live stream caught both their faces. And I have the footage to prove it. Rodriguez frowned. He knew Leonard knew his work was meticulous. Knew his uniform was always spotless until now, with fresh water stains spreading across his trousers. Leonard didn't break eye contact with Rodriguez. I spilled water while mopping. I was cleaning it when Mr. Williams arrived. She's lying. Derek, always dramatic, turned back to his camera. Look at this mess. Completely unprofessional. The number of viewers ticked higher. Hundreds now watching the humiliation unfold in real time. Michelle Torres, HR director, emerged from the elevator heels, clicking against the marble. At 34, she'd built her career by avoiding public conflict, and this situation screamed liability. "What's going on here, Derek?" she asked, her voice level. Derek smirked. "Just documenting misconduct for legal purposes." Michelle's eyes narrowed. Live streaming a disciplinary action was a violation of company policy 12. But Derek was 2 rungs above her in the hierarchy. Leonard's silence was deliberate now. Years of boardroom negotiation had taught him when to speak and when to let an opponent dig his own grave. In the corner of the live stream frame, the black briefcase waited. Its presence was a quiet, unspoken threat. Security arrived. The air thickened. Derek's voice rose, feeding his online audience, tossing casual remarks laced with prejudice into the stream. Leonard absorbed each one without reaction. His phone buzzed again. "Traffic's bad. Start without me if you have to." Another text from Chairman R. Leonard's mouth curled not into a smile, but into the faintest trace of something close. If only Derek knew what was coming. By the time the crowd on the 58th floor had swelled to 50 people, phones out, eyes wide, Leonard had already decided exactly how this would end. He would not raise his voice. He would not fight for dignity. He would simply open that black briefcase at the perfect moment and watch as everything Derek thought he knew collapsed in front of him. The clock ticked toward 10 o'clock a.m., and somewhere deep in the undercurrent of that moment, the first spark of a storm was already catching fire. The murmur of the gathered crowd was low, but constant, a living background hum to the theater unfolding on the 58th floor. Beneath the polished surfaces and immaculate branding of Hamilton Global, something far uglier had been allowed to flourish for too long. Leonard Carter could feel it not just in Derek Williams's sneering words, but in the quiet complicity of the onlookers. They didn't need to say anything. Their hesitation said enough. Fear kept them still, the kind of fear that made good people turn away from injustice, because challenging it felt like touching fire. Derek's voice cut through the space like a scalpel. "You think you can just stroll in here, make a mess, and disrespect me in front of my team? Not in my building?" The phrasing was deliberate, territorial, proprietary, as if the floor itself belonged to him. He gestured vaguely to the cluster of employees standing near the coffee station, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and fascination. Leonard's pulse stayed steady, his breathing measured. If Derek thought humiliation would provoke him into a mistake, he was wrong. The years had taught him the difference between reacting and responding, between emotional satisfaction and strategic victory. And this wasn't about pride. It was about precision. Michelle Torres lingered on the edge of the group, her eyes flicking between Derek and the steadily growing number of viewers on his live stream. She knew the policies better than anyone. What Derek was doing was a liability, a legal and reputational time bomb, but the corporate ladder had a way of bending spines. Derek's position gave him enough influence to make her job a minefield. The viewer count surged again. Derek read another comment aloud, this one dripping with the kind of casual cruelty that could pass as joking in the right company. Several people laughed quietly, nervously around the edges of the room. Leonard caught the sound. It was the laughter of survival, not amusement, a subtle reminder of how prejudice thrives, not only in the actions of the aggressor, but in the silence of witnesses. Luis Rodriguez, still standing nearby, seemed unable to reconcile the Leonard. He knew, a man whose work ethic and demeanor were beyond reproach with the caricature Derek was painting for the camera. Luis's weathered hands tightened around the handle of his clipboard. He opened his mouth twice as if to speak, but each time the words died before they could form. The irony was that Leonard had seen this, all before in different offices with different faces dressed up in the language of fit or standards or professionalism. It was never just about one insult or one man. It was about an entire ecosystem that let bias pass as authority. And Derek, with his performative dominance, was merely the loudest symptom. From where he stood, Leonard could see the black briefcase resting in the shadow of the supply cart. It was an object Derek hadn't once paid attention to, too blinded by his assumptions to consider that someone in a cleaner's uniform might own something of value. The very existence of that briefcase and what it contained was the proof Leonard had been collecting for 3 long weeks. He knew the exact metrics that tied Derek's bias to financial losses. He knew the names of clients who had left because of it, and he knew that when the right people heard the evidence, Derek's smirk would be the last thing anyone remembered about him. For now, though, he stayed silent. Every insult Derek threw was more rope. Every condescending glance to the camera was another knot tied, and Leonard, patient as the tide, was willing to let him keep pulling. Somewhere down the hall, the elevator chimed a sound so ordinary it barely registered, yet it carried the weight of inevitability. The ripple effect had already begun, and no one in that room, least of all Derek Williams, was prepared for what would surface when the tide finally turned. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and a hush fell over the 58th floor. 3 board members stepped into the hallway, their tailored suits and polished shoes radiating quiet authority. Behind them, Hamilton Global's chairman Robert Hanley emerged, silver hair gleaming under the recessed lights, his presence enough to make even the most confident executives straighten their posture. Derek's smirk faltered just for a heartbeat before he replaced it with a strained expression of control. "Perfect timing, sir," he called, waving his phone toward the approaching group. "You're just in time to witness the termination of an insubordinate employee who happens to be one of our newest executive appointees." Hanley's voice cut through Derek's performance like a clean blade. The crowd went still. Someone's phone recording trembled in their hand. Derek's mouth opened, but no words came out. Leonard stepped forward calmly, the black briefcase in hand. The tension in the room shifted, invisible, but undeniable. "Chairman Hanley," he greeted evenly. "We were just discussing departmental culture." Derek blinked, his eyes darting between Leonard and Hanley. "Wait, what? This man's a cleaner." This man's a cleaner. You know, Mr. Williams," Hanley interrupted, his tone frost-edged but controlled. "This man is Leonard Carter, Vice President of Organizational Integrity, appointed by unanimous board decision last month. He's been conducting a comprehensive cultural assessment of this floor. You just provided a rather thorough live demonstration of the issues we suspected." The silence that followed was so complete, it was almost oppressive. The only sound was the faint horror of the HVAC system and the click of Michelle Torres's pen as she instinctively began taking notes. Leonard placed the briefcase on a nearby desk, snapping open the latches with deliberate care. The gold Hamilton Global insignia glinted in the light as he laid out a neatly organized stack of documents. "Over the past 3 weeks, I've gathered direct evidence of discriminatory behavior in your department, Mr. Williams. This includes hiring biases, unethical client management practices, and hostile conduct toward both staff and contractors. Each incident is documented, time-stamped, and corroborated by witness testimony." He gestured toward the group of employees who had gathered, their earlier nervousness now mingled with something new, anticipation. Sarah Monroe, her phone still recording, stepped forward. "I have 8 months of recordings," she said quietly but firmly. "Some of it is hard to hear." Derek's face blanched. "This is absurd. This is a setup. You're all conspiring enough." Hanley said, his voice sharp enough to make Derek flinch. "Every word you've spoken today has been live-streamed to over 2,000 viewers, and your own comments have left no room for misinterpretation. If you have any explanation, you'll present it to the board immediately. Otherwise, I suggest you remain silent while we review the evidence." Leonard clicked a remote, and the wall-mounted screen lit up with a presentation slide. Data appeared. Turnover rates, revenue losses, client feedback, all linked directly to Derek's leadership. "Your department's turnover rate is 71% compared to the company average of 22%. 3 major clients have terminated contracts this quarter, citing cultural misalignment and unprofessional treatment. Combined, these losses have cost Hamilton Global over $8 million in annual revenue. As the numbers sank in, Derek's bravado drained from his expression. He glanced around the room, perhaps searching for allies, but the faces he found were closed, resolute. Even Luis Rodriguez, who had avoided confrontation earlier, was staring at him with a grim set to his jaw. This isn't just about numbers. Leonard continued, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that made every word land. It's about the kind of culture we allow to exist inside these walls. You've created an environment where prejudice isn't just tolerated, it's rewarded. Talented people leave because they know there's no future here for them unless they fit your narrow definition of who belongs. That ends today. Michelle Torres stepped forward, her professional mask intact, but her tone carrying the gravity of the moment. Mr. Williams, your behavior violates multiple sections of our employee conduct policies as well as state labor laws. The legal implications are serious. I strongly advise you to stop speaking and allow this process to proceed formally. A murmur of agreement ran through the gathered employees. For the first time, Derek looked smaller, less like the man who had strutted across the floor with a camera in hand, and more like someone who understood too late that the ground beneath him was giving way. Hanley glanced at Leonard. Mr. Carter, do you have enough to conclude your assessment? Yes, sir, Leonard replied, and I recommend immediate action. He tapped the remote again, and the screen shifted to a new slide labeled Proposed Cultural Reforms. The list included mandatory bias training, anonymous reporting systems with board oversight, and real-time culture monitoring to identify issues before they escalated. This isn't about punishing one man, Leonard said, turning to face the crowd. It's about protecting the integrity of this company and the people who make it what it is. No one should come to work wondering if they'll be judged by anything other than their contribution. Hanley nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping the room. Effective immediately, Derek Williams is suspended pending termination. Security will escort him from the building. Mr. Carter will assume oversight of this floor's operations until a permanent replacement is appointed. The decision landed like a stone, dropped into still water, the ripples visible in the employees' shifting expressions. Relief, vindication, even a faint spark of hope. Derek's voice, when it finally came, was barely more than a rasp. You can't do this. I've given this company 20 years. And in that time, Hanley said evenly, you've forgotten what those years were supposed to stand for. 20 years is nothing if the legacy you leave is one of division and loss. Security moved forward. Derek looked around one last time, but the only eyes meeting his were cold or unflinching. As he was escorted toward the elevator, the live stream, still running from the phone, he clutched. The floor felt different, lighter somehow, as though the air itself was shaking off a weight it had carried for far too long. Leonard closed the briefcase, his expression unreadable, but his posture relaxed for the first time that morning. The real work, the rebuilding, was just beginning. But for the first time in weeks, he could see the possibility of something better taking root. And as the elevator doors closed behind Derek Williams, a new chapter opened. Not just for Leonard Carter, but for everyone who had been watching, recording, and waiting for the moment when the tables would finally turn. Its own clips circulating across social media tagged and red-tagged under headlines that range from biting satire to scathing condemnation. On Twitter, hashtags like Juror Hamilton Global Power and Prejudice and Leonard Carter were trending in 3 countries. In the hours that followed, news outlets picked up the feed. What had begun as a crude attempt to humiliate a man in a janitor's uniform now played out on national broadcasts as a stark parable of arrogance meeting accountability. The video was dissected by analysts on morning talk shows, business correspondents, and civil rights advocates. Frame by frame, Derek's sneer, his mocking words, and the quiet composure of Leonard were replayed until they were etched into public consciousness. Inside the company, the effect was electric. Conversations that had long been whispered in private broke into the open. Employees who had endured subtle slights, passed over promotions, or coded remarks began to share their experiences, not with bitterness, but with a new sense of possibility. The sight of Leonard standing unshaken under Derek's taunts had struck something deep, the realization that silence was no longer the only option. Luis Rodriguez was among the first to feel the shift. For years, he had navigated his role, quietly avoiding conflict, believing that speaking up would risk the job that kept his family afloat. But now, as he passed colleagues in the hallway, he noticed the change. The way people met his eyes, the nods of acknowledgement, the whispered good job for the small stand he'd taken by questioning Derek that morning. Michelle Torres, the HR director, felt a different kind of weight. Her inbox was overflowing with reports, some historical, some fresh, detailing patterns of bias across multiple departments. It was daunting, but it was also the kind of transparency she had never seen in her tenure. For the first time, she believed they might actually have the will to address it. Leonard, meanwhile, was already working. His desk was stacked with folders and reports, not because the board demanded immediate deliverables, but because the moment called for momentum. He knew too well how easily the initial shock of a scandal could fade into complacency if action didn't follow quickly. The credibility of his role and the trust of those who had watched him stand his ground depended on turning outrage into structure. Outside the glass walls of Hamilton Global, the company's reputation hung in the balance. The markets had reacted, sharply, shares dipping in the first hours of trading, but the rapid suspension of Derek and the public announcement of a cultural reform initiative had begun to stem the bleeding. Institutional investors were watching closely, their calculus shaped, not just by numbers, but by the question of whether the firm could convincingly prove it had learned from the incident. It wasn't only the investors watching. Advocacy groups were sending formal statements to the board, some offering support, others demanding further accountability. The Service Employees International Union praised Leonard's undercover work, calling it a landmark in corporate transparency. The National Diversity Council reached out to request his participation in a conference on organizational change. And then there was the public. Comments on the viral videos told a story of their own. Finally, someone with power who uses it to protect people, not crush them. One read another. This man kept his dignity the entire time that his leadership. The narrative had shifted from outrage to inspiration, and Leonard's name was now synonymous with resilience under pressure. But the most profound ripples were the private ones. The emails Leonard received from strangers. A young analyst in Chicago who had left her job after a similar humiliation, thanking him for showing that it was possible to win without shouting. A retired banker who confessed he had once been a Derek Williams and had spent the last decade trying to make amends. A single mother in Houston working as a night cleaner who said she'd watched the video 3 times and now felt braver than she had in years. Within Hamilton Global, the reform proposals Leonard had outlined in the conference room began moving faster than anyone anticipated. A new anonymous reporting system went live within a week. Departments scheduled mandatory cultural competency workshops. The company's internal communications, once sterile and pre-functor, began carrying messages from the board that spoke plainly about the value of diversity not as a legal shield, but as a business imperative. The ripple effect was also visible in small, almost invisible moments. People lingered longer in break rooms, no longer afraid. That casual conversation could become ammunition for ridicule. Junior staff began voicing ideas in meetings without scanning the room first to gauge safety. A maintenance worker was spotted having lunch in the main cafeteria with a mid-level executive. A simple act that weeks earlier might have drawn raised eyebrows. Leonard knew better than to romanticize the change. Corporate cultures didn't transform overnight, and prejudice rarely vanished without resistance. He also knew there would be pushback, quiet resistance from those who saw his work as disruption, or worse, as unnecessary. But he was prepared for that. The beauty of working in the open under the full glare of public attention was that retreat now carried a cost that even the most entrenched could not ignore. Late one evening, long after most of the floor had gone dark, Leonard stood by the window of his new office, looking out over the city lights. In the reflection of the glass, he could see the faint outline of the uniform he had worn for 3 weeks, its memory still stitched into his mind. He thought about the people who had stopped him in the hall to say thank you, about the look on Sarah Monroe's face when she realized she wasn't alone in what she'd witnessed. Change he knew wasn't just about policies or public statements. It was about restoring belief that integrity could survive in a place where ambition often smothered it. And that belief, once sparked, could travel further than anyone expected. The ripples were still moving outward. Some would reach the farthest corners of the company. Others would break against walls that refused to move. But somewhere in between there would be people who saw what had happened, remembered it, and decided quietly, firmly that the next time they faced their own Derek Williams, they wouldn't look away. Leonard didn't need to imagine the rest. He could already feel it beginning. Weeks passed, and yet the echoes of that morning on the 558th floor still reverberated through Hamilton Global. The company's swift public response had not only stabilized investor confidence, but also drawn praise from business schools, diversity advocates, and even former critics. Leonard Carter had become more than a vice president. He was a living symbol of what leadership looked like when integrity refused to bend. But Leonard was careful not to mistake symbolism for victory. The structural issues that had allowed someone like Derek Williams to flourish were far older and more deeply rooted than one scandal could erase. His calendar was filled with meetings, some with eager allies, others with wary executives who nodded at his reforms in public, but bristled at them in private. Resistance was not gone. It had simply learned to speak more softly. One crisp morning, Leonard walked into the company auditorium, where over 200 employees from every level had gathered for a town hall. The stage lights were warm against his face as he looked out at the mix of maintenance staff, junior analysts, department heads, and senior leadership. His prepared remarks sat folded in his pocket untouched. Instead, he spoke from memory, from the part of him that still remembered the feel of the janitor's uniform and the weight of silence. I want you to know, he began, that the uniform I wore was never a disguise to me. It was a reminder of how easy it is to misjudge someone based on what they seem to be in a single moment. A reminder of how invisible talent, dignity, and ambition can become when people stop looking for them. I didn't go undercover to catch one man making a mistake. I want to understand the air we breathe here and to see if we had the courage to change it. He told them about the messages he'd received from strangers across the country, people who saw in Hamilton's scandal a reflection of their own workplaces. He described the janitors who now held seats on the Cultural Advisory Committee, the interns whose first weeks at the company now included mentorship with senior leaders, the executives who had volunteered to attend training they could have avoided. But understand this, he continued, his voice steady. Culture is not a memo. It's not a one-time workshop or a slogan on a website. It is the sum of the smallest choices we make every single day. And if we want a legacy worth being proud of, we can't wait for someone else to make those choices for us. We have to own them. There was a moment of silence in the auditorium, the kind that comes when words land exactly where they were meant. To outside the walls of Hamilton Global, the ripple had become a wave. Other companies had begun calling not just for consultation, but to borrow Leonard's undercover method. 2 Fortune 500 firms announced pilot programs modeled on his approach. A prominent business school invited him to design a case study for their leadership curriculum. The phrase "the Hamilton Standard" began circulating in HR circles, shorthand for responding to discrimination with speed, transparency, and public accountability. Leonard welcomed the recognition, but he knew the next battle was already on the horizon. Cultural reform had a way of attracting opportunists, those who saw it as branding rather than conviction. He had no interest in letting Hamilton Global's transformation become a trophy without teeth. He pushed for quarterly audits, external oversight, and a system where employees could rate departmental culture as openly as they reviewed products online. On a rainy Friday afternoon, Leonard sat in his office looking over the latest cultural health report. Metrics were moving in the right direction. Retention among underrepresented employees was up. Reports of bias were being addressed in record time, but one note in the data caught his attention. A particular division showed signs of disengagement, the same quiet withdrawal he had seen before Derek's downfall. It was a reminder that the work was never finished. That evening, as the city lights blurred against the rain-slick glass of his window, Leonard thought about the word legacy. Too often it was treated as something carved in stone at the end of a career. But to him, legacy was alive. It was in every policy he pushed forward, every conversation that made someone feel seen, every leader he held accountable. The next battle, he realized, would not be as dramatic as the one that had made headlines. There might be no viral video, no trending hashtag. It would be slower, quieter fought in the everyday interactions where prejudice liked to hide. But that didn't make it any less urgent. He reached for his pen and began drafting a new proposal, not for the board, but for the people, a pledge that anyone in the company could sign, committing to speak up when they saw injustice, to back those who stood alone to protect the dignity of every role, from the corner office to the night shift. By the time he set the pen down, Leonard knew that the moment on the 47th floor would not be the peak of his career. It would be the foundation. And from that foundation, he intended to build something that could outlast him. As he turned off the light and stepped into the quiet hallway, he thought of all the battles yet to come and smiled. The first spark had already been lit. Now it was time to keep the fire alive. In the end, Leonard Carter's journey was never just about exposing one man's prejudice. It was about proving that even in the highest towers of power, where title, status, and perception seem to dictate worth, truth can still pierce through the glass walls. His story reminds us that no role is too small, no voice too quiet to ignite change that reshapes an entire institution. The events on the 58th floor were dramatic, yes, but what made them powerful wasn't the public humiliation of a man like Derek Williams. It was the courage and patience Leonard showed in the face of arrogance, the deliberate choice to gather truth rather than lash out in anger, and the way he turned a private injustice into a public reckoning. There is a universal lesson here. The most effective battles against bias are often fought not with fists or fury, but with evidence, preparation, and an unshakable belief in one's own worth. Leonard didn't simply want to win an argument. He wanted to change a system, and in doing so, he showed that transformation doesn't happen by accident. It requires intense strategy and a willingness to stand alone until others find the courage to stand with you. This story also challenges us to look in the mirror.